So welcome to EL's fifth webinar. The topic on discussion today will be Yemen, Iran, and American policy in a new era. We're about 100 days into President Joe Biden's administration. He's made Iran and Yemen two of his focuses, and there's a lot of contest, it seems, within the administration as well as around it about the relationship between those two policy files and indeed how they should be related as well as how they are related. So to try and unpick that, we have assembled a panel of experts. We have first Oved Lobel, who is a policy analyst from the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council. We have Ari Heistein, who's a researcher and chief of staff to the director at the Institute for the National Security Studies. And we have Fatima Al-Awsra, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. So welcome to you all. Thanks for being with us. We're going to go around the panel for 10 or 15 minutes each, and then we'll go to some questions. So Oved, if we can go to you first.
All right, can everyone hear me? Okay, so yeah, I'm here primarily because I just wrote a report for EER on the Houthi-Iran relationship, pushing back on the conventional narrative that this was a recent tactical thing against Saudi Arabia. But before I go into that, I just want to explain my conception, and I'm happy for Ari and Fatima to expand or disagree with me. But my conception of the war in Yemen, because I think the way most people have read it, if all you're reading our media reports, is you'd have heard a lot about the Saudi blockade, and you'd have heard a lot about Saudi airstrikes, and you'd probably have read that America was somehow behind this war because they were selling weapons and helping the Saudis with logistics. And you probably would not have heard of the Houthis. And insofar as you did, you would have heard Houthi rebels, because that's often how they're described in the media. And I just want to illustrate how insane that is and how insane the US approach is right now to Yemen. So I'm just going to illustrate with a hypothetical. So it's 2014 in Iraq, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has just declared the Islamic State's caliphate. And instead of bombing him, the US appoints a special envoy and continuously tries to engage him, swearing off all military force and asking him to stop constructing the caliphate and to stop with his murders and massacres. Now, I hope that sounds insane to people, but that is basically what's happening in Yemen. You have, broadly speaking, you have an ideologically uncompromising jihadi group that is trying to establish an Islamic State. That is what this war is about. And they're not, there's really not much to discuss with them when it comes to that non-negotiable demand. And every time we have tried to talk to them, the response has usually been unconditional surrender in exchange for nothing, right? They'll just say, end the blockade, end all support for the Yemeni government, and also leave us in power. Like that's their conditions. So that's the first thing. This needs to be understood not as a war so much as an Islamic State jihad. And the Houthis really do pound for pound match Islamic State in terms of brutality. They're just they're camera shy and they don't publicize it as much, but it's really chilling to read about their regime. And I think that's important to understand. And it's also important to understand that in every war, there's an aggressor. And in this case, the Houthis are the aggressor. So despite it, Saudi Arabia intervened ineffectively and with hideous civilian casualties, but they intervened legitimately. They are not the aggressor in this war. So when you read in the paper that the way to stop this war is to end Saudi airstrikes and to end all support for the Saudis, terrible though some of the things they've done have been, that is nonsense. And so now so how did we get there? How did we get to this Houthi jihad? So conventionally, when people talk about the Houthis, they say that they're part of this. So okay. Well, let's go back. They're the Zaidi Shia, right? And the Houthis are said to be this Zaidi Shia revival movement, and they were a response to two real political, religious, economic marginalization. And in this conventional narrative, basically, they rebelled against the government of Saleh in order to, I guess, gain more rights. Although it's unclear. These people never really specify what the Houthis rebelled for, but they consider it a legitimate rebellion. And over time, because the Saudis got involved, the Iranians saw an opportunity to needle the Saudis, and therefore this alliance relatively recently developed, this tactical alliance, not ideological at all, between the Houthis and Iran. And that's and it's the Saudis' fault. In this narrative, the Saudis are blamed for all of this. They say it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Saudis wanted to prevent a Yemeni Hezbollah, and therefore they created one by driving the Houthis and Iran together out of necessity. Now, what I spoke about in my report, what I wrote about in my report, is that is just not true. The links between the Houthis and Iran go back to 1979. And you can actually draw a straight line between the two main figures from that time period. So it's Salah Ahmed Falaita and Badr al-Din al-Houthi. He's the patriarch of this family. They go to Iran in 1979 and they hook up with Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, and they bring back his ideology to Yemen. And they, throughout the 80s, they developed this group, and it's basically an Islamic Revolution study group. So initially it's called the Union of Believing Youth, then it evolves into the Assembly of Believing Youth, and eventually just the Believing Youth, out of which evolves Ansar Allah. But this is all the Islamic Revolution, and this is how they talk about themselves. So if you listen to Hussein Badr al-Din al-Houthi, so his son, who's considered the first leader of the movement, his political references are all to Iran and Hezbollah. And in the report, I detail just how many links there are. Like, not only did they all live in Iran, like the whole family lived in Iran, but they were also traveling to Syria and to Sudan, which at the time was essentially under the control of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And they lived for a long time in Beirut as well. Like they were traveling back and forth and explicitly seeking to turn this Assembly of Believing Youth into Hezbollah. So this has been going on for decades. And over time, Iran saw more opportunities to increase this support, and it guided them through this evolution, and it literally guided them through the exact evolution of Hezbollah down to the names. So one of the core components of Hezbollah in Lebanon, before it became the organized group in the 1980s, was called the Believing Youth, and this was an Islamic Revolution study group, same as in Yemen, and they were linked because the Zaidi revival movement, so-called, because they were linked to Hezbollah and Iran. They were guided step by step into how to build an organization and how to build an armed wing. And around 2004, they launched a jihad. And the current war is just an extension of that jihad. This war did not start in 2015, and this war did not start because of Saudi intervention. And the Houthi-Iran relationship is not a result of the Saudi intervention. And you can, if you listen to what the Houthis have said about what they're doing, they're very explicit. They do not view this in terms of Yemen per se, and they do not view this as rebelling for any particular rights. If you look at their rhetoric, they view this as an overarching battle against Israel and America and its influence in the region. And that includes the Gulf states, which they consider Zionist and American puppets. So not only are they trying to set up this essentially an extension of the Islamic Revolution, and if you listen to the Iranian officials and the Houthi officials describe it, this is what they talk about. They are an extension of the Islamic Revolution, and they are trying to destroy Iran's enemies. So it's also, just as an aside, it's sort of a mistake to call this a proxy war. I think it would be best to just refer to it as a jihad. And the only way that you're ever actually going to halt the jihad is to militarily defeat it. Now, we've tried engaging the Houthis and Iran for America directly has tried to engage them for at least 6 years. But since 2004, regional and international actors have been trying to engage them, and they abrogate or just ignore any agreement they make and continue their wars of expansion. And for some reason, the commentary now dates the war in Yemen and the problems in Yemen to 2015, but it just isn't true. Like even through 2010, with a few ceasefires in the middle, this jihad continued, and the Houthis just kept expanding. And they set up this revolutionary regime that basically replicates Iran's regime. And they have openly said that they want that to expand up the Iranian Peninsula and eventually to attack Israel, though I'll leave that to Ari to discuss. But yeah, that's just a brief overview, but just to understand basically that this is not, as much as you hear about Saudi Arabia is not the primary problem in Yemen. In fact, it's not even really a problem at all anymore, because as multiple officials have testified, Saudi Arabia is engaging in good faith, right? They really want to extract themselves from the war. They realize how badly this has ended for them. But the Houthis in Iran will not let them, and they escalate every single day, qualitatively and quantitatively, with new missiles and drones. And as Kyle was saying before, so the Houthis in Iran can't really be viewed as separate problems. You can't compartmentalize the Houthis and then deal with Iran separately. They are extensions of one another, and you can't engage them diplomatically without legitimizing them. And just want to mention in terms of the blockade, because you hear so much about the blockade and how that's the reason for the humanitarian suffering, and it's not great. But first of all, the capacity for the Saudis to actually enforce whatever blockade exists is very dubious. And second of all, it really doesn't impact food and fuel. And as humanitarian officials have recently testified, the problem is not food and fuel getting in to the country. It's coming in. The problem is people can't buy it, and Houthis are diverting it. And the former UN humanitarian coordinator in Yemen testified to the Senate recently that the main, if not the only problem, was this Houthi police state that was basically stealing all of the aid and ensuring that it went to its loyalists instead of to the people who needed it. And that is the humanitarian problem right now, or at least the primary humanitarian problem. So when you hear policymakers talk about ending the war in Yemen and just flooding it with humanitarian aid, that's not going to work. It's not going to work by pressuring the Saudis, because the Saudis are already playing ball. And it's not going to work by flooding the country with humanitarian aid, because that's really just empowering the Houthis and not really helping anybody. So I think I'll leave it off there. I just want to make sure that people understand that these are not two sides fighting over material resources. You should think of the Houthis as a Shia Islamic state that is explicitly trying to expand past Yemen. It's not just about Yemen.
Thank you very much. This is a great start. Ari, if I can turn to you for 10 or 15 minutes.
Sure. So if I could just follow up with one comment on what Oved said, is I think that ideologically there's certainly some similarity between ISIS and, or in terms of radicalism, the radicalism of the ideology and the extremism. There's certainly some similarity between ISIS and the Houthis, but I would say that the Houthis have much better weaponry than ISIS ever had. The ISIS never had precision missiles that could go 1,500 kilometers. There's just no comparison. I mean, I think the fact there was no state backing ISIS is a huge difference. The whole world was against ISIS, and so I think that presents a much larger challenge. Or that's why the Houthis present a much larger challenge. Okay, so I'm going to be brief, and I am going to present the Israeli perspective on Yemen. So the Israeli perspective on Yemen is essentially similar to the way, in some ways, the way Israel views the Lebanese issue, the Iraqi issue. They view it through the lens of Iran. So what this means is essentially that the primary focus is on the Houthi threat, with some secondary interests and the risks posed by AQAP. I would say that the Houthi threat can be broken down into basically 4 different components. There's the potential for long-range fire on Israeli territory. This is the most potentially serious, but it hasn't really materialized yet fully. Then there's the maritime threat. There's naval mining, anti-ship missiles, explosive drone boats. Then there's the potential for support for Palestinian militant groups or other Israeli adversaries through equipment, training, or actually even potential participation in the fighting. And then there's the potential for operations abroad, terror attacks on Jewish or Israeli facilities in third countries. The last of the four seems like the most likely to materialize for a number of reasons, including the fact that unlike Hezbollah, which sort of graduated from what you could say is like an Iran-backed proxy group involved in a civil war and also involved in fighting against Israel, and then later on carried terror attacks out against Jewish and Israeli targets abroad, I think that the Houthis would have a much more difficult time of potentially operationalizing something like that. Number one, I think because the Iranians are not investing in the same way in terms of providing the Houthis with those types of capabilities. And I think one of the major advantages that that Hezbollah has had and has utilized over the years has been essentially a sympathetic diaspora. And as far as I know, there is not much of a sympathetic diaspora to the Houthis around the world. Okay, so now as for the question of how best to cope with the Houthi precision missile threat, there's no clear answer to that. Neglecting it, on the one hand, could allow it to grow. But of course, on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's a potential for being overeager to engage with it. And that could end up dragging Israel into the Yemeni quagmire unnecessarily or prematurely. So I think in some ways you could see this as representing the overall more general dilemma that Israel faces when seeking to cope with Iran's precision missile threat throughout the region. This is something that Israel is also dealing with in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, anywhere where Iran has willing proxies or allies, then it is seeking to provide them with advanced missiles just because it knows that the solution potentially dealing with these threats is extremely difficult based on the fact that number one, you don't need a whole lot of them to cause significant damage. These are precision weapons. These are not statistical weapons. And number two, defending against them is also extremely costly. And so you can essentially bleed your adversary to death in terms of budget. If each interceptor costs $100,000, then launching them, even if they don't hit their intended targets, is an extremely costly proposition for a country to defend against these attacks day in and day out. According to the report that I recently published with my friend and co-author from Israel's Ministry of Intelligence, the Houthi ability to inflict damage on Israel is at present fairly limited. It also seems that it is not a high priority for the group at the moment. That could change for a variety of other reasons. If you're interested in me delving further into that, I'll be happy to do that later. But our recommendation is ultimately that Israel should monitor the Houthis for now. The primary focus should not be on the intentions of the group. I think the intentions of the group are fairly opaque, as has been alluded to here earlier. Obviously, there's an extreme hostility towards Israel from the Houthis. I mean, it doesn't take more than hearing their slogan to understand that. But the question of how they intend to operationalize that hostility is, I think, an open question. It's not clear entirely that they have concrete plans to attack Israel just yet. And there could be a variety of reasons for that, whether they're deterred by Israel, whether they're focusing first and foremost on the campaign against Saudi Arabia, whether it's an issue of limited capabilities. There are a few potential reasons for that. More generally, when thinking about the conflict in Yemen, I see there really only being two possible futures for Yemen. There's unification under a Houthi-dominated government, probably something similar to what is going on in Lebanon with Hezbollah. You basically have a militia that is far and away the dominant force in what is seen as a legitimate government. And then the alternative is essentially partition. So I'm not speaking on behalf of any institution or any organization, but in a personal capacity. Personally, I think given that what we know about the situation on the ground in Yemen, Israel should consider supporting, perhaps quietly, the partition of Yemen. I believe that having a rogue state with a fig leaf of legitimacy is more challenging than dealing with a rogue state that the whole world knows is a rogue state. And I think the whole world, with very few exceptions, will be against the Houthis, and I think that will be useful in containing the group. From the Israeli perspective, the Southern Transitional Council has also expressed pro-Israel sentiments, and that could prove, and they could potentially prove to be a useful partner for promoting stability in a strategic location. The STC's affiliation with the UAE certainly appears to be a strong indicator that it is inclined towards promoting regional stability. The UAE is obviously a country that is very much a status quo power and seeks to promote stability in the region. They, like instability in the Red Sea or other maritime routes, would be something that would be extremely detrimental to the UAE. So I imagine that the groups that they support and to some degree or another control would also sort of abide by those types of would abide by similar interests. And to conclude, I think that in terms of referencing partition, there's no doubt that it will be tragic, and it is tragic to think of the idea that there are people condemned to live under Houthi rule. But and that would sort of be accepting that to agree to the partition of the country and to support the partition of the country. But at the same time, I think you sort of have to read the writing on the wall and understand that 6 years of war, well funded by Saudi Arabia, and the use of mercenary advanced weaponry and a lot of money and a lot of blood have not really succeeded in dislodging the group up until this point. And so I think that it may just sort of be coming to terms with the fact that for the foreseeable future, the Houthis will be in control of the territory that they are in control of now. And the question is really how best we can sort of mitigate the threat that they pose to other people in Yemen and also to the broader region in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. I think there'll be a lot to come back to there. Fatima, if I can turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and thanks to Oved and Ari for excellent presentations. You really leave me nothing to talk about. I think you all covered critical things that we need to really consider when talking about Yemen and ending the conflict in Yemen. Perhaps maybe what I could shed some light on is how really the internet, how the international community has mismanaged the war in Yemen and the conflict in Yemen and the way that it's perceived by the international community. There's certainly a disconnect between Yemenis and the international community on so many issues. And I often get this question of, why is the Western world and the international world siding with the Houthis? And especially when the Houthis are showing hostility towards the United States, hostility towards Israel. And the fact of the matter is that people in Yemen feel that they are fighting a war on behalf of the United States and Israel, and it's really not costing anybody any single cent. They're paying the price for this, and the Houthi rhetoric is quite strong on that end. They often say our main enemy is not Saudi Arabia, it's actually the United States. And in a recent talk show where I was invited, there was a Houthi spokesperson, and the person in the talk show was asking him, how do you feel about Biden administration lifting the terrorist designation of your group? Do you feel like this is a sign of good faith where you can engage with the Americans? And he said, we can't trust Americans. We'll ultimately patch it up with Saudi Arabia, but we cannot trust Americans or Israelis. They don't want to see good in our country. And that's basically the main ideology. And that's the thing that they have. I think they really do believe in that their interests cannot at any point intersect with the United States, that and this is what they're basically selling to everybody and to all of their, followers. And so what I want to talk about is kind of like just, the mismanagement of this war to varying degrees. There is just this incessant fear that the international community is actually empowering a non-state actor, a violent non-state actor like the Houthis, that's working within a regional network of adversaries that support a grand Khomeini vision that the Islamic Republic of Iran is actively pursuing. And Yemenis are just paying the price for this. So the first point of mismanagement I'd like to focus on is that the Houthi ideology and links to Iran are really not taken into account within the peacemaking process. And they're often either underestimated or ridiculed. So when we hear the Houthi followers say things like death to America or curse on the Jews, it's actually often described as harmless venting, that it's just militants expressing how they feel. And part of the reason why is because I think we really in the West can't think long term. We're thinking about just, the fact that they're not at our borders yet, so they're not a problem for us yet. Let's deal with them when they become a problem. And this is really a problematic approach because they are going to become a problem sooner or later. So why are you waiting until then? Why are you waiting until a catastrophe happens at your own border? And, this justification for me, for a lot of Yemenis, is really not acceptable. It really fails to recognize both the Houthis and the Iran's end goals. And we've often played a tactical game with the Houthis, while Houthis and Iran are extremely strategic and they're in for the long run. They're playing strategically. They have an end objective in mind. The end objective that the international community has in mind, really, it's actually not there. It's just, empty things like end the war or end the conflict in Yemen, which is starting to sound somewhat concerning, because an abrupt end to the war in the way that the international community wants it, which is the stopping of arming of Saudi Arabia, and an abrupt withdrawal of Saudi Arabia would just leave the Houthis and Iranians empowered in Yemen. And that's a conflict that it seems that the international community is really okay with, because as long as you're not supplying weapons, then, you're somehow, I don't know what this calculation is, but somehow you feel like a lot of what I read, makes me have the assumption that if it's not really, if you're not providing weapons, then you're surely, morally vindicated or morally, just not responsible for anything else. And that's really a mistake. That's an intervention. I think the lack of intervention is an intervention by itself, an intervention on behalf of the aggressor. It's amazing how the messages that are coming from the Houthis align with some of the messages that I read in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And it's really disappointing. So for the Houthis, for Iran, I mean, Iran has been, I agree with everything that Oved said in terms of, how the Houthis often depict themselves as just this force for national liberation, when in fact, they're just another weapon for Iran and Hezbollah's transitional axis of resistance. And the Houthis' links to Iran, just like Oved said, is historical, ideological, and Iran's weaponization of the Houthis have been only possible because Iran has invested many years arming and training the group. It's decades cultivating a critical intellectual and cultural and ideological ties with the northern Yemeni Zaidi community, which is the sect from which the Houthis hail. And for Iran, Iran's definitely, like Iran's goal in Yemen is twofold. The first one is to prolong Yemen's war for as long as possible in order to keep the Saudis bogged down, and force them to withdraw, or at minimum have them pay a really heavy price for any victory that they might achieve. So it's just a war of attrition at this moment, and they're testing the Saudi defenses. And the second, as the tension with the U.S. are increasing, Iran wants to leverage the Houthis to showcase its ability to destabilize the Gulf region and threaten the global energy markets. And this is a way for Iran to showcase power. And this is also extremely dangerous. So the problem is that the international community is really overlooking Iran's role. And again, this is perhaps because somehow we've been duped to assume that the Western world takes a lot of responsibility for the humanitarian suffering that's happening in Yemen. And this brings me to my second point, is that the justification to end any type of involvement in Yemen is based on really a false assumption that the humanitarian catastrophe is solely the responsibility of the Saudi and the US. And it completely bypasses the Houthis' role in abusing the local population in exploiting the humanitarian crisis. And this is one of the reasons why there's really a wide distance between Yemenis and the international community. A lot of Yemenis feel that aid has been, or the aid narrative thing, it's just been exploited to the max in order to prove just one point, which is the Saudis are bad, get them out. And as we're pursuing that line, there has been sort of like a willingness to overlook how the Houthis are abusing the humanitarian situation in Yemen. Maggie Mitchell, a reporter with the AP, had written excellent reports that showcased how the Houthis were stealing aid, were starving the local population, and they're a major factor in terms of famine. Yemenis understand that also the Houthis have in their system, they've infiltrated, the majority of government institutions. So, and they made sure to hire their loyalists in every critical position that has to deal with, collection of funds, and also in every position that has to deal with the international community. So when aid packages are negotiated, it's often the Houthis that are negotiating these aid packages and where they go. And these packages often go to their loyalists and supporters. So by default, everybody who's not supporting them is really not getting prioritized in any way. And that's part of the starvation that I haven't seen covered in the press until today. And it's really unfortunate. We've seen, World Food Program packages that militants are actually enjoying in the battlefield. The family of martyrs often get also these aid packages regularly, and food baskets. So even, I think Oved was right. It's not for a lack of food. There is no lack of food in Yemen. There's access to food. There is access to all of this, but what we don't see is that how is this being channeled? How is this being distributed? What the Houthis are really good at is that, and one of the journalists told me this, is that they see the starving children, and what they do is they just send cameramen their way, not money, not food. And they don't have any incentive to actually help these kids, because they also assume that they need to be the responsibility of anybody else besides them, because what they're concerned about is just having as much having as much funds as possible for their war effort. So, I mean, Houthis get funds not only from the oil sector, from the Hodeidah port, which they're controlling, from the telecommunication industry, so all of this is being channeled, redirected towards the war effort, and then they leave the they leave the field open for humanitarian organizations to come in and contribute. And I think that there is this kind of like it's a paradox. While people really need humanitarian assistance, we are helping and enabling the Houthi militias by not pressuring them to provide for people whom they control. They're not even providing salaries for these people and assuming that this is something that the Arab coalition needs to provide. So it's really a great thing to be a Houthi at the moment. Just zero accountability. You can do whatever you want to do with impunity. And what's really baffling is that the United Nations is not really taking a strong position with the Houthis. The UN envoy is going above and beyond, really bending over backwards to please the Houthi militia. And one of the to the extent that it's actually, I mean, he is culturally insensitive. One of the things that many Yemenis were extremely shocked with is how the UN envoy actually says to Abd al-Malik al-Houthi, who's the supreme leader of the militia, he says to him, Sayyid Abd al-Malik, which means Master Abd al-Malik. And Sayyid is maybe a harmless word for somebody who doesn't know, but in Yemeni context, it brings up it's kind of a symbol of repression and of Houthis' entitlement and right. This one thing that I'm sure all of you know and familiar with is that the Houthis claim that they're ordained by Allah to rule Yemen because they're descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, through his daughter Fatima and Ali, and they feel that they are more entitled because they come from that lineage, because they come from that bloodline. And the group who represents, the Zaydis are often described as Sayyid or Ashraf, Sharif or Hashemites. And they feel that this is a privilege, all privileges in governance should be awarded for descendant of the Prophet's line from the Zaydi sect. This is not something that is shared by Sunni Muslims. And here lies in the problem. Fundamentally, the Houthis want absolute control over Yemen. They want absolute power. They don't see sharing. They don't share power from that perspective. And if they do, it's because they grant it. So if you're from another political party, it's because you have to realize where you stand in this equation, in this religious equation and ideological equation that they're putting for Yemen. This stands against the spirit of the Yemeni revolution of 1962, which overthrew the Zaydi imamates. Zaydis have ruled Yemen for almost a millennia, and they've ruled it through repression, and they've ruled it through, this belief that they are the only people who could be in power. And this kind of makes me, probably brings me to my final point, which is under this context of absolute power, of, not playing well with others, not playing well with the international community, absolute tyranny when it comes to governing Yemen, and complete alliance with Iran. One of the things that's missing from the scene is a future vision for Yemen. 10 years ago, the international community was so supportive of the Arab Spring, was so supportive of giving, people and from the Arab world all support in order to have this vision of freedom, progression, democracy, in belief that democracies make things better, makes us, it makes, brings us closer to international and regional stability. But what's happening today is that this future vision for Yemen is missing. The international community is happy with the bare minimum for Yemen, which is just negative peace. So it's like, let's just stop the war, end the war. Whatever happens, come to an agreement between each other, whether you're Islamists, whether you're Iranian, loyalists, just try to come together. It's okay if your human rights are traded for security. And all of these are not really strong messages, So the lack of a vision for a stable Yemen is one of the things that really irks a lot of Yemenis, and it's so whenever we hear things like, let's end the war, let's end the conflict, it just means immediately translates to this is not going to be well thought of, and you're going to have millions of people living under conditions that they cannot challenge because you're going to leave the Houthis, and you're going to leave Yemen to the absolute power of the Houthis, and which will transform into a theological state that Yemenis just have been or cannot really exist with. So I know I've taken too long, so I'll end it here. Thank you.
Not at all, it's right on time. So I'm going to pick up actually where you left off in 1 second, just to say to the audience that you can put questions in the chat, which is probably the easiest way to submit them, or there is a raise hand feature if people wish to ask more directly. But I'm going to abuse the position of the chair and ask the first one, which is to pick up where you left off in terms of the vision for Yemen, in the sense that what the international community, which probably should be in scare quotes here, but that collection of states and powers and interests should do about Yemen. And I think we, from the discussion, it's kind of agreed that one component here, the awkward fact is that there's going to have to be basically force deployed to alter the balance against the Houthis, because they are not amenable in any other way, and they are currently on the ascendancy. And obviously, in the wake of Iraq, that becomes very politically difficult to advocate for. So, picking that question up, and also Ari's point about potential repartition and things like this, if we go around the horn once again from Oved to Ari and then back to Fatima on what you make of basically what to do next. Like how would we proceed if we were going to get to some viable end state for Yemen?
So yeah, I can take a shot at that. So I have my own personal opinion, obviously, but it's totally unrealistic and probably not worth mentioning because it does involve the use of military force. So I think in this situation, because we know how the Biden administration thinks and how its surrogates think, because we've seen some pretty outrageous nonsense coming out of Congress and various other government institutions. The best thing that they could do right now is to do no harm. And I think the best way to do no harm would be to stop publicly pressuring the Saudis, because the Saudis are the only thing standing between Marib and calamity and Houthi takeover. And to stop empowering the Houthis by diplomatically engaging them, because it's useless every single time. It's humiliating for the United States and the international community, and it legitimizes them, and we should not be doing that. And as a component of that, I think we should really, I know this sounds terrible, but we should not just be flooding the country with humanitarian aid to allow the Houthis to entrench their political power. It sounds good. I understand it's well intentioned, but it's counterproductive. That's what I would say about it.
Thank you, Ari.
Yeah, so it's a pretty tough question. I would agree that I think pressuring Saudi Arabia to end its campaign, I think in some ways is sort of dealing with a problem from several years ago. If you look at the actual casualties that Saudi Arabia has inflicted on Yemeni civilians, it was high, and it seems like they were extremely reckless in 2016, 2017, but the numbers have gone down dramatically to the point where it's, maybe one killed or injured a month, and that's obviously you want the number to be zero, but considering the fact they're operating in a war zone, there's very clear significant improvement on that. So let's say number one, I think it's important to make that point. I would say also that potentially giving support to southern Yemen, if there is a partition or whatever arrangement is made, I think that the best argument you can make against a place that is poorly governed by an authoritarian is to show that there are alternatives that are much better. And so I don't really, like I said, I don't see it being a realistic possibility to dislodge the Houthis in the near future. But I do think that if there were a southern Yemen that was successful and flourishing, then it would cause people in northern Yemen to think a little bit more about what type of governance they want. I think ultimately, if the Houthis are going to be overthrown, it's probably going to be something that their own people are going to have to do, not something that is going to be imposed from the outside.
Thank you, Ari. Fatima, if you have some thoughts.
Yes. So perhaps the first thing is don't underestimate Iranians' influence in Yemen. And it doesn't necessarily mean please bring Iran to the discussion table, because that doesn't mean anything but more political machinations from Iran, really. But it means be smart and calculate what are the long-term objectives are. And Iran really wants more power in the Middle East. That's something that it's not ready to relinquish. Iran wants a better economic standing with the international community. Iran wants the Iran deal to be back on the table, and is going to use the Houthis as a card to pressure the international community. So that's a question there, or that's an issue there that we have to focus on. Second is, don't run with everything that the Houthis are giving you. And the Houthis are basically telling the world that they're going to engage in a political process, in a diplomatic process, but they're telling their people something else. And there's kind of like a disconnect between what they tell the UN envoy and what they tell their people. And we just, again, have to be smart about the long-term objectives of this group, which is absolute power. I agree with Oved on the issue of the humanitarian assistance, that it has to be reevaluated and conditioned, because what we're doing now is we are giving the Houthi absolutely just free reign in Yemen and giving them all of the resources to deepen and entrench themselves further in the country. Finally, maybe I just want to say something here on the issue of partitioning Yemen. I have to say that this is a very sensitive subject at the moment, because if it happens that Ma'rib falls to the Houthis, a big number of the northern community will have to go to the south. This will create northern animosities, because southern people always just after unification felt that this was a mistake. So 4 years later they had a civil war, and since then they felt like they are under occupation by the northern regime. I would say up till 2015 they probably had a strong grievance. After 2015, just things have changed, and it became a safe place for people, just like Ma'rib had become a safe place for a lot of northern Yemenis. Aden has become also a safe place. The second is that there is the Islah Party, or the Congregation of Reform in Yemen, stands quite resolutely against the secessionist project. This will unleash probably a civil war within a civil war if the South decides to secede, if there's no real agreement. And if Ma'rib goes in, I can definitely see an alliance between the Houthis and the Brotherhood in order to take all of Yemen back. The Southerners are exclusionist. You know, when I talk to them, they're like, we don't know anything about the North. We don't want to do anything with the tribal, fiasco that's happening over there. Please leave us alone. We were communist once. We were anything else but this, So they want to be left alone. But with the Houthis and the same as with the Islah Party, they're not content with a vision of a divided Yemen. And I could definitely see alliances shifting. I mean, we saw uncomfortable alliances happen in the past, like between, President Saleh and the Houthis, ironically, were fighting for all of this time. So we saw those types of alliances, and now we could definitely see these alliances forming again to stand against a divided Yemen. And there will be, we will be losing a lot. So I think it would be good to proceed with caution, to maybe, empower the South that has long been disadvantaged, but also maintain a strategic, it's kind of like not make things go worse. Just, I hope things are patched up in the south of Yemen, because it's kind of like a distraction in the whole process of really maintaining a resolute focus on fighting the Houthis. And I do agree, ultimately, Yemenis have to fight the Houthis, but it's impossible to do so if Houthis have weapons. So I would love for the United Nations to disarm the Houthis. And everybody thinks that, and I think that there's some type of a group think here that's not really helpful, because people go like, oh, well, how can the Houthis, disarm? How can you ask tribal communities to disarm? Yemen is one of the most armed nations in the world. So this is not really helpful, because the Houthis have ballistic missiles. They have, as Ari said, they're more sophisticated than Al-Qaeda and ISIS put together. They're controlling the state. It's a totally different ballgame. They're like the modern day Taliban, in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. But the problem here is that you will never have equality, freedom, democratic institution, a stable government, if this actor continues to monopolize weapons. And, despite the arms embargo, we saw the U.S. Navy fleet in the Fifth Fleet capture a huge amount of weapons on the Arabian Sea. Just Russian guided missiles and rifles. And I would argue that these weapons have been killing more Yemenis than the Saudi intervention did. It's the rifles that have just really the rifles, the ballistic missiles that have decimated communities, that had, put people in exile, that had empowered the Houthis in the countries. And, this issue needs to be addressed.
I think if we had more time, we would pick up on the Taliban comparison. But we have a question from the audience. I think we may turn out to be our last. He says, thank you for insightful and well-delivered presentations from all, and I'd second that. How do you think the American desperation for a diplomatic settlement on the nuclear file will influence America's policy in Yemen? If we go first to Oved and then around the same order.
Yeah, so the linkage between these two publicly has been extremely annoying. I know the State Department has said there's no linkage, parallel tracks, and in the most recent briefing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so the UN Special Envoy Tim Lenderking said that there was no official relation between the two, but he hoped that Rob Malley would make progress on the JCPOA talks, and that would influence Yemen policy. Now, in terms of U.S. desperation to get a deal. I think that the U.S. would give up anything to get a deal. And if in their heads they link Yemen to the nuclear deal, I don't think they're linked at all. Especially because if you remember, when we actually had the deal in 2016, the Houthis were firing on American ships. So like clearly there's no relationship between these two things in the eyes of the Houthis. But in the eyes of the Americans, they think, and this has been openly said by some people, that the reason that all of this is happening is because we are making Iran do this. We are abusing Iran by sanctioning them. And that's why everything is happening in Yemen. And the only way we can get a ceasefire in Yemen is if we lift sanctions on Iran. This is being argued in Congress. So I could easily see the US eventually sacrificing any involvement in Yemen whatsoever, just to try to, quote unquote, incentivize the Iranians to stop the Houthis, as if that were a real thing, from attacking the Saudis and continuing their jihad.
Ari?
Okay, so I would say I didn't agree with a good amount of Trump's foreign policy, but I still think that it can be instructive in some ways. And I would say that when you look at sort of the Obama administration's approach toward Iran due to the nuclear issue, you sort of see that the nuclear negotiations and then the nuclear deal led the Obama administration to treat Iran, and I guess its proxies as well, sort of with kid gloves. And then Trump withdraws from the nuclear deal. Iran doesn't withdraw. Then Trump kills Qasem Soleimani. Iran doesn't withdraw. You see that there's actually, the way the Iranians see things is sort of the nuclear deal. Sorry, there's a little bit of traffic outside. I don't know if you can hear
Don't worry about it.
But you see that the Iranians sort of see the nuclear deal as a nuclear deal and everything else as everything else. And so it's not really, they're not doing it because they expect America to be nice, and they themselves don't plan to be nice. I would say that Iran really upped its regional interventionism after the nuclear deal was signed. And for a while, there was no response, particularly from the Obama administration. But you realize from the Trump administration that there's actually a lot of room to get a lot done without necessarily jeopardizing the nuclear deal. Ultimately, what the Trump administration taught you is that the Iranians are in the nuclear deal because it's a good deal for them. And they're not doing it because they think Americans are going to be nice. And so hopefully the Biden administration has learned from that.
Thank you, Ari. Fatima?
So I actually so far do like what President Biden is doing. So, and the reason is, I think the US is getting involved in Yemen on a really granular level. You know, they're thinking of Yemen as a puzzle that they want to solve. And they've appointed the US Special Envoy, Tim Lenderking, who's a seasoned diplomat and understands the region. And this is a promising start. We've seen him deliver a very balanced testimony to the US Congress, and which gave them, it actually reassured a lot of Yemeni people I know. And people were thinking, wait, there's somebody there who actually understands the complexity of the situation and what the Houthis really want. And just that type of assurance can bring us a little bit closer to more mature discussions really about the peace process in Yemen, as opposed to, panic over certain things like Hodeidah or, suddenly Ma'rib. And I think this is what's really needed, just a more of an in-depth discussion about Yemen. And then what was really good was, the recent State Department report where they've given a briefing on both Lenderking and Senator Murphy's visit to the region, and in which they've highlighted that the Houthis rejected their proposal. The Houthis even flat out did not meet the UN envoy, whom he spent so much time cultivating a relationship with. And they've actually ridiculed the UN envoy, Martin Griffith. And they're like, he came with nothing and left with nothing. We refused to meet him, and they were trying to show to their power base that they have all the power, that, they're bringing the UN and the international communities to its knees because they have the monopoly of violence in Yemen. So the Houthis are getting cockier, I would say. And this is a real, it's a real problem. And for the United States to be challenged in this way is a good reality check. It's a much needed reality check. So right now, the United States can see the hurdles firsthand through its involvement, rather than it being communicated through the UN envoy time and time. And I would have to say the UN envoy office was always neutral, diplomatic, unable to condemn any party or another, and unable to really tell us the truth about what's going on. So there was a little bit of naming and shaming that happened in the last State Department briefing, and I think so many people said this is not going to work. Naming and shaming doesn't do anything. This is not the UN's approach, But did the other way around work at all? We've been silent. Did anything work? I think it's really important that there's awareness about who is obstructing the peace in Yemen, because it's really not in the best interest for the Houthis to have peace. The best interest for the Houthis is to maintain the status quo, because that gives them the power that they need. So, yeah, I think that, also I've seen things that were also promising from the Biden administration, such as not, lifting the terrorism designation. I don't care about the terrorism designation, but then appointing, having the Treasury take 2 people high up on the Houthis list as terrorists, and, putting sanctions on them. That works. Maybe sanctioning Abdel Malik al-Houthi would work. Maybe sanctioning the upper leadership would work. We need to be a little bit more, strategic about the way that we pursue this. Unfortunately, I feel like in terms of tying with the Iran deal, the U.S. Yemen is really not. I agree. Yemen is not really attached or tied to the Iran deal, but I think that it's probably one of the cards that Iran wants to use nevertheless. It's like, we can give you this if you can give us that. And Yemen is such a low-hanging fruit for them that it just completely makes sense. So.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we are up against time, but we have some questions that I'm going to just group them together, and I'll give you the questions and the question, and then any closing statements you want to add, and we'll just go one last time round. So it's basically about the influence of the Houthis in the West, or the way they're perceived, at least in the West. And some people point out that particularly on the left of the spectrum in the West, that the Houthis are kind of perceived as a marginalized group, or an oppressed group, and or the representatives of such, rather. And there's obviously a problem there that might be addressed. And generally the Houthis' messaging infrastructure, which obviously mostly piggybacks on Iran's influencing campaigns and things in the West, and how you think they affect the discourse that we have. So if we start again with Oved and go for the last time around.
So this is the question on the Houthi lobbies?
Yeah, I say generally there's sort of the perception that we have of them.
Yeah, there's an ideological blindness and in ignorance. I'm not really sure there's much more to it than that. But we were discussing at the beginning how often on the left side of the political spectrum, there's a tendency to blame the United States and anything associated with it for all problems. And because of that, you overbalance, and whoever the United States is against must be the good guy. And in this case, the Houthis, who people generally know nothing about, right? Like Ari was pointing out, they don't have a huge diaspora. This is not Hezbollah. People, insofar as they've heard of the Houthis, they've read about them just the way the major papers write about them, which is rebels. These poor, oppressed rebels who are just fighting because they were economically religiously marginalized, and that's all anyone knows about them. No one knows about the atrocities. No one knows how they've covered Yemen in landmines, or behead people, or kidnap people for compliance, or murder children of opponents, blow everything up. Like, no one knows any of that stuff. It would be great if it were publicized, but unfortunately, because of the ideological bent and just total lack of information about the Houthis, that is what is stopping U.S. policy from actually being realistic.
Thank you. Ari?
Yeah, so I would say that I wouldn't necessarily attribute any unbelievable PR capabilities to the Houthis, but I think the major advantage they have is that the Saudis are much worse. And so they've just done such a bad job of making their case that pretty much anybody could beat them. And then, of course, I guess you do have the fact that Yemen is in some ways a black hole of information. I mean, obviously, it's a very unsafe place for journalists to be. And so I think the fact that even if you do have reports, let's say social media, and you have people who are reporting about what's going on in Yemen, it's very limited, or it's very hard to get like accurate and reliable information out of Yemen. And so I think in some ways, when the water is kind of muddied, I think that can play to the Houthis' advantage.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ari. Honestly, I think there's deliberate misinformation. And, when you see leading members of Congress just espousing and just writing things that are completely inaccurate, you're not an author on Yemen, go consult the policy analyst on Yemen. But when, I hear things or I see things like, these are an indigenous group of people. We're all indigenous. All of Yemenis are indigenous. I mean, for God's sake, this is an indigenous marginalized group of the Shia sect of this and that. And we fall into these facile arguments in order to prove a political point. We are where we are because Congress wants to assert its war powers, privileges, and has used Yemen as a case in point. There might be a just debate there about who launches war in Congress. I understand that, but please don't rope Yemen into these arguments because, I can't remember that old adage is when you have a hammer, everything is a nail, and I something like that. Or you have a nail, everything. So it's kind of. This is what I'm seeing is that they're doing everything that they can do in order to say, this was a mistake by the administration. We have to do it. In some way, I feel like if Congress was given a choice and if Congress was going to do this, they might actually, do the right thing and start and start condemning the Houthis for what they're doing, start condemning Iran for what they're doing. If they were given that choice, they might think of protecting the American interest. But I think this was one of the problems that we're facing. There's deliberate misinformation that is being that is circulating, and the Houthi lobby in the United States is really strong, and there are two types of lobbies. There's really the humanitarian Houthi, who would always talk about the humanitarian crisis and the role of Saudi Arabia, but will never talk about the human rights violations that are happening. Will never talk about starvation under the Houthis, again, because that's the agenda that they stay on. And I think it plays on the feelings of people and the emotions of people rather than, it appeals to that side of you rather than the logical side, that wants to calculate how can we do this in the least messy way possible. So I think there's that. And then there's the humanitarian organizations who want to maximize their footprint in Yemen, want to do more. This is a source of employment for a lot of people, activists were really sharing something on social media, which is a UNDP project of a bathroom in IDP areas. And it was just a couple of bricks that you could have built by yourself. Anyone could have built with, $50 to do these bricks, and they're publicizing it. And there was a blowback from the Yemeni activists and the community. They're like, you're taking billions of funding in the name of Yemen and giving us crumbs. We could do this. And, I can tell you this firsthand. When I was an international consultant in Yemen, I was monitoring a village where food voucher programs for a village. The entire village was getting $50,000, but my fees were probably half of that, that were allocated, were half of that to just monitor if these people are who they are and just to do the evaluation. The amount of money that's being spent right now on Yemen in terms of operational head costs, I don't even know how to calculate. And the amount of money that is being spent unwisely, there's no way that you could do a monitoring evaluation in Yemen. I mean, back in 2014, when there was a state, 2013 and 2014, it was a very corrupt environment. And right now, with the lack of MNE, it's even, it's just inexplicable. So I don't know where taxpayers' money is going. I'd like to see it go to the right places, but it's just not going there. And I think, this is part of the problem. We need to be mature on every level, and the discourse has been hijacked by the humanitarian crisis. And I think this is just not strategic. And it's part of the reason why Yemen is where it is today.
Thank you so much. And thank you all of the panelists for today. That was a really excellent event. I feel much better informed for that. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day or night.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.